What I'm going to do now is create a new integration services package using SQL Server data tools, of course, and create some variables in various scopes and kind of show you how variables work within a package. All right, so I'll start out, File, New Project. I'm on an Integration Services project, and I'll put it in samples, and I'm going to call this Variables. Creative name. Okay. So Visual Studio whirs and cranks a bit and creates this new project and opens up this package. All right, I want to rename the package. So I'll go over here to Solution Explorer, and I'm going to call this package Variables as well. Okay. It's always good to name your package an appropriate name for what you're doing with it. All right, so the easiest way to look at the available variables within a package is to right-click on the designer background and select Variables. Now, I already had that window open down here, but if it's not open, it's a really easy way to get to it. As you can see, there's some toolbar buttons there. So the first thing I want to do is add a variable, which just creates that line within this grid. And as you can see, it creates a variable with the default name of variable. So I'm going to create this as top level, sort of a functional name for a variable. Okay, the scope is variables. Remember, that's the name of my package, so that identifies that this is a package level variable. You can think of it as a global variable within the package. And the default data type is int32. But as you can see, there's various other data types you can use. So these are the restricted list relative to the numbers of data types in data flows. This is the restricted generalized set of variable types that you can use. Okay, and the default value for a numeric value, int32 is an integer, is 0. And here's where you can provide an expression instead of a static value. So if I wanted this variable to calculate an expression or evaluate an expression every time this variable is referenced, then I could put it in there, and the ellipsis button there opens up the expression builder, which is a nice GUI tool for building expressions. But I'm not going to talk about expressions right now. Okay, but otherwise this variables window is a dockable window within Visual Studio. I'm going to leave it at the bottom, but you can have it a floating window. If you have multiple monitors, you can move it to another monitor. You can dock it in any side of the designer that you want to, all that goodness that you get for this being a Visual Studio environment. Okay, so I'm now going to come over here to the SSIS toolbox and add a sequence container to this control flow. Okay, so this is selected. I'm going to come back over to my variables window there. Notice that it's still selected. And I'm going to create another variable. So this time I'm going to name it second level. And notice that the scope is still variables. So this is a mildly annoying quirk of the package designer. Even though I selected the sequence container before I created the new variable, it added the variable with package scope. So, fortunately, this is a relatively easy thing to fix as long as you notice that and remember that it creates it with package level scope by default. Okay? And then you have to remember to change it. So, mildly annoying. All right, so to do that, all you need to do is select it here in the window and then select this Move Variable button there. And that opens up the Select New Scope dialog box. All right, all I need to do is come down, drill down into this hierarchy. Now I only have a sequence container in the control flow so far, but if I had a lot of other controls, they would all be included here. If I had multiple data flows, they would have one node for each data flow, and then I could drill down into the components in that data flow. So this could be a very, very large hierarchy here, but it's simple in this case. And I just select sequence container. And now that changes the scope to sequence containers, you can see there. Okay, another thing about the variables window is that it changes what appears. So I'm actually going to dock that open. Let me Move that down a bit. Not quite that far. Okay, so notice that I have the package selected. More specifically, I don't have any components within the control flow selected. So this is going to display, or the variables window is now going to display just the variables in that scope. When I select sequence container, notice that now I see both of those variables. Because remember, the child can see the parent's variables. And so both top level and second level are in scope for the sequence container. So this can be a little bit confusing. If you do look at the variables window and there's a variable that you know is there, but it's not appearing in the list, it may be because you have the incorrect object selected, so you're only seeing the variables in scope. But I'll show you in just a moment that you can actually change that behavior. But first, now I'm going to select this top level variable. And I'll go over here to the properties window. Okay, so I have top level and variable. Here's where you can get access to all of the properties of a variable. And you can change many of them. You can see that some are grayed out so that they're not changeable here. So you can't change the scope from the properties window. Here's that unique GUID that I mentioned. It's going to be unique within the package. Probably across, the way GUIDs work, probably across all packages for every instance of SQL Server and so forth. But then there's a number of properties that you can change as well. Now, one thing to be aware of about the properties window is that it doesn't always respond immediately and display the full set of properties for the selected variable as it should. So if you select a variable and there are only a couple of properties listed, click back in the designer and select the variable again. And that usually gets things back in sync. Okay, so that's where you get access to the property variables. Now, I'm back over in control flow. I just clicked in the control flow surface, so essentially the package is selected. Another option that you have down here, well, by the way, you have delete variables, so you can select a variable and delete it. That's kind of boring. But you have this grid options button here. So as I mentioned, you can change the behavior of what variables appear as different objects are selected within the control flow surface. So in essence, what it's doing is it lets you filter what variables are being displayed. So if I select Show Variables of All Scopes and click on OK, notice that even though I have the package selected, I'm seeing all of the variables because I've changed that behavior. So you can customize this to whatever works best for you. A lot of people like the default behavior, so they only see the variables that are in scope. But sometimes, as I mentioned, you can lose variables essentially, thinking that they're not there and you try to recreate them, and that causes problems as well. But this can also be handy for finding a variable in a complex package when you're not sure of the scope. Display them all. There may be hundreds of variables. You may have to do a lot of scrolling and trying to find it, but at least you can find that variable and see what scope it is. Okay, so normally you probably want to, at least when you're starting to learn integration services, leave that option unchecked, just because it can make it easier to find variables. And you just have to remember, though, that not all variables for the entire package are necessarily going to be displayed at any given time. Okay, then another option is Show System Variables. And I'll click on OK. And now we have a lot more variables in the window, because this is now showing all of the available variables, including both the custom variables that I created, as well as all of the system type variables. So you can scroll down the list and start to get a feel for what kind of information is available at the package level. So for example, there's machine name, and there's a package ID and package name. It's called variables, product version, start time, and so forth. And then finally, there is top level. And so you can tell the system variables from the user variables by these icons. I'm not quite sure what those icons are meant to represent, but you can see that the system variables have that additional rectangle in the upper left part of the icon. Another thing to notice is that because I have the package selected, all I'm seeing is the package level variable. That second level variable is not displayed. But it would if I go back over, if I reduce this window a little bit, and select the sequence container and scroll down, Now I can see that second level as well as the top level variable. Okay, I'm going to return to the default here, uncheck that. Oh, and you can also change the columns that appear as well. One that I generally like to turn on is namespace. Just make it a little bit easier to see what namespaces, particularly if I'm creating custom namespaces. All right, I'll reduce the size of that window a little bit. So that shows you a lot of the ways that you can work with variables within the package designer, but just keep in mind scope and the different settings so that if you're looking for a variable and don't see it, you may have to change the setting or go to a different object or whatever.